A mysterious dog enters St. Raphael's Children's Hospital, unnoticed by anyone. But what it does beside the bed of a child in a coma is unbelievable. When the police uncover the truth, the story takes an unexpected turn that will touch your heart. The fluorescent lights of St. Raphael Children's Hospital cast their familiar glow across the pristine corridors as Emily Carter adjusted her navy blue scrubs, preparing for another night shift. The December wind howled outside the windows of the century-old building in the heart of Boston, carrying snowflakes that danced against the glass panes like tiny, frozen ballerinas. Emily had always found solace in these quiet moments before her shift began, when the pediatric ward settled into its nighttime routine. At 32, Emily had earned a reputation as one of the most dedicated nurses in the hospital. Her colleagues often joked that she must have guardian angels watching over her patients, given her uncanny ability to anticipate their needs. Little did they know how much those words would come to mean in the days ahead. Another late shift. Sarah Martinez, the day shift nurse, greeted her with a warm smile as she gathered her belongings at the nurses' station. "You're going to turn into a ghost yourself if you keep haunting these halls every night." Emily managed a small laugh, though the word ghost sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Someone has to keep an eye on our little warriors," she replied, scanning through the patient charts on her computer screen. Her eyes lingered on one name in particular, Noah Bennett, the 6-month-old boy who hadn't opened his eyes in 3 weeks. The accident that brought Noah to St. Raphael's had been tragically simple: a moment of inattention, a fall from a changing table, and suddenly the vibrant baby boy lay silent in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and worried faces. His parents, Mark and Jessica Bennett, had barely left his side since then, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and despair that Emily had seen too many times in her career. As Sarah left for the night, Emily began her rounds, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. The pediatric wing was relatively quiet, with most of the children already asleep. She checked on each of her patients, adjusting blankets, checking IV lines, and whispering gentle reassurances to those still awake. When she reached Noah's room, she paused in the doorway. Jessica Bennett had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping awkwardly in the recliner beside her son's bed. Mark must have gone home to shower and change clothes, their routine over the past weeks. Emily approached the bed quietly, checking Noah's vital signs and making notes in his chart. The soft beeping of monitors provided a steady rhythm to the night, but something felt different. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She turned toward the door, expecting to find Dr. James Reed making his late-night rounds, but instead, her heart nearly stopped. Sitting in the doorway, completely still and eerily calm, was a golden retriever. Its fur seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights, almost as if it were glowing from within. The dog's eyes, a warm amber color, met Emily's with an intelligence that made her breath catch in her throat. Emily blinked hard, certain she must be more tired than she thought. Dogs weren't allowed in the hospital unless they were registered therapy animals, and she knew no such visits were scheduled, especially not at this hour. She glanced at the security camera in the corner of the room, wondering how the animal had made it past the front desk unnoticed. "Hey there," she whispered, not wanting to wake Mrs. Bennett. "How did you get in here?" The dog didn't move, didn't bark, didn't make a sound. It simply continued to watch her with those knowing eyes. Emily took a step toward it, and that's when something even stranger happened. The dog stood up gracefully and walked into the room, straight to Noah's bedside. It sat down next to the bed, its posture almost protective, and turned its gaze to the sleeping child. Emily reached for her phone to call security, but something made her hesitate. The dog's presence didn't feel threatening. In fact, the room seemed to grow warmer, more peaceful. The constant hum of medical equipment that had become such a familiar backdrop to her nights seemed to fade into the background. As she watched, Noah's fingers twitched slightly, the first voluntary movement she'd seen from him since his admission. The monitors showed no change in his condition, but Emily could have sworn she saw a small smile flicker across his face. "This is impossible," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her short brown hair. She needed to report this to follow protocol, but something about the dog's presence made her pause. It reminded her of stories her grandmother used to tell her about guardian angels taking different forms to watch over those in need. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine checks and paperwork, but her mind kept returning to Noah's room. Each time she looked in, the dog remained in the same position, silent and vigilant. What puzzled her most was that none of her colleagues seemed to notice its presence. They walked past Noah's room without a second glance, as if the golden retriever was invisible to everyone but her. As dawn approached, and the first hints of sunlight began to paint the Boston skyline in shades of pink and gold, Emily made one final check on Noah. The dog was gone, leaving no trace of its presence. She might have convinced herself it had all been a dream if not for one detail. On the floor beside Noah's bed lay a single golden hair, shimmering with an otherworldly gleam. Emily picked up the hair, studying it under the morning light. In all her years of nursing, she had seen many things that defied explanation, but something told her this was different. This was just the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about faith, science, and the thin line between the two. As she prepared to hand over to the day shift, Emily made a decision. Instead of reporting the incident, she slipped the golden hair into her pocket. Something told her she needed to investigate this further on her own. Little did she know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone at St. Raphael's Children's Hospital. The morning staff began to arrive, bringing with them the usual bustle of shift change. Emily gathered her belongings, her mind already forming plans to research the hospital's history. As she walked toward the exit, she cast one last look at Noah's room. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a flash of golden fur disappearing around the corner, but when she looked again, there was nothing there but the early morning shadows playing tricks on her tired eyes. Outside, the Boston winter greeted her with a fresh blanket of snow. As Emily walked to her car, her pocket felt unusually warm where she had placed the golden hair. She touched it through the fabric of her scrubs, and a sense of purpose washed over her. Whatever was happening at St. Raphael's, she was now part of it, for better or worse. The mystery of the golden dog and its connection to Noah Bennett was just beginning to unfold, and Emily Carter found herself at the center of a story that would test the boundaries between faith and reason, between the seen and unseen worlds that existed within the walls of St. Raphael's Children's Hospital. If you love animals and want to watch more amazing stories, don't forget to subscribe to help the author, leave a like down, and tell us which city you are watching from. Let's continue. The morning after her encounter with the mysterious golden retriever, Emily found herself in the hospital's basement archives. Instead of heading home to sleep, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she navigated through rows of metal filing cabinets and dusty boxes, each containing pieces of St. Raphael's history. The golden hair she'd found still rested in her pocket, seeming to pulse with a subtle warmth that defied explanation. "I knew I'd find you down here," a familiar voice echoed through the basement. "Doctor." James Reed emerged from between the shelves, his usually pristine white coat slightly rumpled from a long night shift. At 45, James was one of the hospital's most respected pediatricians, known for his brilliant mind and unwavering skepticism toward anything that couldn't be explained by science. Emily straightened up from the box she'd been examining, trying not to look guilty. "Dr. Reed, I was just looking into our mysterious visitor." He raised an eyebrow, causing Emily's heart to skip a beat. "You saw it too." Relief flooded through her. "The golden retriever. I thought I was the only one who—" She paused, studying his face. "Wait, what did you see?" James ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, his expression troubled. "I was doing my final rounds last night when I saw it outside Noah Bennett's room. By the time I turned around to get a better look, it was gone. I convinced myself I was just tired, but then I checked Noah's latest readings." He pulled out a tablet, showing Emily the charts. His neural activity showed significant improvement during the exact time window when we both saw the dog. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she took the tablet. The readings were unlike anything she'd seen in her career. Sudden spikes in brain activity, followed by periods of stability that hadn't been present since Noah's accident. "This is impossible," she whispered, echoing her words from the night before. "That's what I thought too," James replied, leaning against a filing cabinet. "I spent the rest of my shift going through recent security footage, trying to figure out how a dog could have gotten into a secured pediatric ward." He paused, his scientific mind clearly struggling with what he was about to say. "Emily, there's nothing on the cameras, No dog, no security breaches, nothing. The basement seemed to grow colder as Emily processed this information. She pulled out the golden hair from her pocket, holding it up to the light. Then, how do you explain this? James took the hair, examining it with the scrutiny of a scientist. Where did you find this? By Noah's bed. After the dog disappeared, Emily watched as he held it up to the light. Does it look strange to you? Strange how? Like it's glowing from within? James started to shake his head, but then his eyes widened. The hair did seem to emit a faint, golden luminescence that defied natural explanation. He quickly pulled out a small evidence bag from his coat pocket, a habit from his research days, and carefully placed the hair inside. "We need to run some tests on this," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he usually reserved for medical procedures. "But first, what were you looking for down here?" Emily turned back to the boxes she'd been searching through. "I had this feeling. I needed to know more about the hospital's history. Something about that dog felt familiar, like I'd heard about it before." Together, they began going through the old records, their search becoming more focused as they discovered that St. Raphael's hadn't always been a children's hospital. Decades ago, it had been a convent run by the Sisters of Divine Mercy, who had also cared for sick children. "Look at this," Emily called out, carefully lifting a leather-bound journal from a box marked 1950s. The cover was worn, but the name Sister Margaret was still visible, embossed in fading gold letters. As she opened it, a photograph fluttered to the floor. James picked it up, and they both gasped. The black and white image showed a group of nuns standing in front of the hospital, and sitting proudly in the center was a golden retriever, identical to the one they'd seen the night before. The dog wore a medallion around its neck, catching the light in the photograph in a way that seemed to leap across time. "Turn it over," James suggested, his skepticism warring with curiosity. Emily's hands shook as she read the faded handwriting on the back. "Sister Margaret with Gabriel, our guardian angel in earthly form, May 15th, 1953. Gabriel," Emily whispered, the name sending a shiver down her spine. "That's what we should call him. The dog from last night." James began to protest but was interrupted by the sound of his phone. Looking at the screen, his face grew serious. "It's about Noah. We need to go up now." They rushed to the pediatric ward, the journal tucked safely in Emily's bag. As they approached Noah's room, they could hear excited voices. Jessica Bennett was crying, but these were different from the tears of sorrow they'd grown accustomed to. These were tears of joy. Noah Bennett was awake. The small boy lay in his bed, his eyes open and alert for the first time in weeks. He was weak, but his vital signs were stable, showing remarkable improvement from just hours before. As James began his examination, Emily noticed something on the floor near the door, another golden hair, glowing faintly in the morning light. But what caught her attention even more was Noah's behavior. The baby, still too young to speak, kept reaching toward the corner of the room, giggling at something no one else could see. When Emily looked in that direction, she could have sworn she saw a shimmer of golden light, there and gone in an instant. Later that afternoon, as Emily finally prepared to head home, she found herself drawn to the hospital's old chapel, a space rarely used now except for quiet reflection. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, she stopped short. Sitting in a shaft of sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows was Gabriel, his golden fur transformed into a kaleidoscope of colors by the filtered light. This time, Emily didn't feel afraid. She walked slowly toward the dog, who watched her approach with those same knowing eyes. When she was just a few feet away, Gabriel stood up and walked to the altar. There, partially hidden behind a fallen hymnal, was a small wooden box. Emily's heart pounded as she picked it up. The box was intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize, and it felt warm to the touch, just like the hair in her pocket. Before she could open it, she heard footsteps approaching the chapel. When she turned back, Gabriel was gone, leaving behind only a lingering warmth in the air and more questions than answers. The box felt heavy in her hands as she slipped it into her bag alongside Sister Margaret's journal. Whatever was happening at St. Raphael's, Emily now held two pieces of the puzzle. As she finally left the hospital, the winter sun breaking through the clouds seemed to follow her like a spotlight, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not with malice, but with expectation. In her rearview mirror, She caught a glimpse of something golden moving near the hospital entrance, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there but swirling snow and the promise of more mysteries to come. The box in her bag seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, calling her to uncover secrets that had been waiting decades to be found. The soft glow of Emily's bedside lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls of her apartment as she carefully opened Sister Margaret's journal. Outside, Boston's winter wind whistled through the gaps in her window frames, creating an almost musical accompaniment to her late morning reading. Despite her exhaustion from the night shift, sleep eluded her. The mysteries of St. Raphael's demanded her attention. The journal's pages were yellowed with age, filled with elegant handwriting that spoke of a different era. Emily pulled her grandmother's old quilt closer around her shoulders as she began to read the first entry, dated April 3rd, 1953. Today, he sent us a guardian. The children were the first to see him, of course. They always recognize heaven's messengers more easily than we do. A golden retriever appeared in our gardens this morning, wearing a medallion I've never seen before. Sister Catherine insisted we send him away, but when little Thomas William's fever broke the moment the dog laid beside his bed, we knew this was no ordinary creature. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the page. The parallels were undeniable. She reached for the wooden box she'd found in the chapel, studying its intricate carvings more carefully in the morning light. The symbols seemed to shift under her gaze, almost as if they were alive. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. It was James. "Emily, you need to come in early today. Something's happening with Noah, and not just him." She could hear the strain in his voice, the sound of a man whose scientific worldview was being challenged. "What do you mean?" 3 more children in the pediatric ward showed unprecedented improvements overnight, and Emily. He paused. "Okay, they're all talking about a golden dog." Emily's gaze fell on a particular passage in the journal. The medallion Gabriel wears is not mere decoration. Sister Agnes recognized the symbols. They match those found in the ancient texts stored beneath the chapel. When the moonlight touches them, they seem to come alive with their own inner fire. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she told James, already reaching for her clothes. "Meet me in the chapel." The drive to St. Raphael's was a blur of swirling snow and racing thoughts. Emily clutched her bag containing both the journal and the wooden box, each seeming to pulse with an energy that matched her racing heartbeat. As she pulled into the hospital parking lot, she noticed something unusual. A golden feather lying on the fresh snow near her parking space. She picked it up, finding it warm despite the freezing temperature. The chapel was quiet when she arrived, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, creating pools of colored light on the worn wooden floors. James was already there, pacing between the pews with barely contained nervous energy. "Look at this," he said by way of greeting, holding out his tablet. On the screen were brain scans, before and after images from the children who had improved overnight. The difference was startling. "I've never seen neural activity patterns like this. It's as if their brains have been jump-started somehow." Emily placed Sister Margaret's journal on the altar and began sharing what she'd discovered. As she spoke, the sunlight hitting the stained glass seemed to intensify, casting the chapel in an almost ethereal glow. "There's more," she said, carefully placing the wooden box beside the journal. "I found this here yesterday, after Gabriel led me to it." James approached cautiously, his scientific skepticism warring with the inexplicable events of the past 2 days. The box seemed to hum with energy as Emily's fingers found the hidden catch Sister Margaret had described in her journal. Inside lay a medallion, identical to the one Gabriel had worn in the old photograph. A circular disc of what appeared to be gold, etched with symbols that matched those on the box. As Emily lifted it, the metal felt warm against her skin, and the symbols seemed to pulse with a soft, golden light. "This is impossible," James whispered, reaching out to touch the medallion. The moment his fingers made contact, the lights in the chapel flickered, and a gentle breeze swept through the room, despite all the windows being closed. Emily continued reading from the journal. The children say Gabriel appears to them in their dreams, leading them through gardens of light. Those who are most ill see him most clearly. Sister Agnes believes he exists between worlds, a guardian spirit taking physical form to help those in greatest need. But there are others who fear what they don't understand. Today, a man in a dark suit came asking questions about our miracle cures. We must protect Gabriel's secret. As if summoned by the words, they heard the soft click of claws on wooden floors. Gabriel stood in the chapel doorway, his fur glowing with that same otherworldly light. This time, he carried something in his mouth, an old photograph that he gently placed at Emily's feet. The image showed the hospital's original cornerstone being laid, and in the background, partially visible, was a door that Emily had never seen before. A heavy wooden door marked with the same symbols as the medallion. "I know where that is," James said suddenly. "It's in the old section of the basement, behind the maintenance room. I saw it during the renovation project last year, but it was sealed shut." They shared a look, both knowing what they had to do. As they gathered the journal and box, Gabriel watched them with those knowing eyes. The medallion felt warm against Emily's palm, almost as if it was trying to tell her something. In the pediatric ward above them, Noah Bennett was drawing pictures, unusual for a baby his age. His mother had shared them with the nurses, page after page of golden dogs surrounded by light, leading children through gardens that seemed to exist somewhere between heaven and earth. As Emily and James made their way to the basement, neither noticed the shadows that seemed to move against the light, or the figure watching them from the end of the corridor, a man in a dark suit, his presence marking the beginning of a conflict that had been waiting decades to resume. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft chime, taking them down to where answers, and perhaps more questions, awaited. The medallion in Emily's hand grew warmer, and somewhere in the hospital, monitors began to record unprecedented readings from every child who had been visited by the golden dog named Gabriel. The basement of St. Raphael's felt different in the advancing afternoon, colder, more ancient somehow. Emily and James made their way through the maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing off walls that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. The medallion in Emily's hand pulsed with increasing warmth as they approached the maintenance room, almost as if it was recognizing its surroundings. "The door should be right through here," James whispered, his voice unusually hushed in the underground silence. He fumbled with his key ring, searching for the maintenance room key. I remember seeing it during the renovation work, but I never gave it much thought until now. The maintenance room was cluttered with tools and cleaning supplies, smelling of dust and old concrete. James moved aside some shelving units, revealing the door they'd seen in the photograph. Heavy oak, marked with symbols that matched those on the medallion. Years of paint and plaster had been applied over it, as if previous hospital administrators had tried to make it disappear. "Look at this," Emily said, holding the medallion close to the door. The symbols began to glow faintly, creating patterns of light that danced across the ancient wood. She pressed the medallion into a circular depression at the center of the door. It fit perfectly. There was a sound like distant chimes, and the door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending even deeper beneath the hospital. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of old books and candle wax. "We should call security," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. They both knew this discovery went beyond normal hospital protocol. Emily took out her phone, using it as a flashlight as they descended the stairs. The walls were lined with more symbols, these carved directly into the stone. At the bottom, they found themselves in a circular chamber that took their breath away. The room was a perfect circle, its walls covered in floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with ancient volumes. At its center stood a pedestal holding a large leather-bound book, its pages open to what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the hospital grounds. But it wasn't the modern hospital, it was the original convent, showing gardens and structures that no longer existed. Emily. "Look at this," James called from one of the bookshelves. He was holding a volume whose spine bore the same symbols as the medallion. Inside were detailed accounts of healing rituals, accompanied by illustrations of what appeared to be divine beings taking animal forms to help the sick. As Emily joined him, a golden feather floated down from somewhere above, landing on the open book. They looked up to find a circular skylight they hadn't noticed before, crafted in stained glass depicting a golden dog surrounded by children. "These books," Emily said, examining more volumes, "they're records of miraculous healings, not just from Sister Margaret's time, but going back centuries. Look at this one from 1847. A golden dog appeared during a cholera epidemic, leading nurses to children who needed help most urgently." James was about to respond when they heard footsteps in the maintenance room above. Heavy footsteps, followed by the sound of someone searching through the shelves. They quickly doused their lights, pressing themselves against the bookcases. The footsteps approached the top of the stairs, and a beam of light cut through the darkness. Emily held her breath, the medallion growing almost hot against her palm. "Someone's been here recently," a man's voice said from above. "Get a team down here. We need to secure these records before they fall into the wrong hands." Emily and James exchanged alarmed glances in the darkness. There was something ominous in the man's tone, something that suggested he wasn't interested in preserving the room's secrets, but in controlling them. The light beam swept down the stairs, nearly reaching them. Just then, they heard a commotion from above, the distinct sound of barking, followed by a crash and surprised shouts. The light beam disappeared as its holder rushed back up the stairs. "Quick," Emily whispered. "We need to document as much as we can." They began taking photos of the books and the map with their phones, working rapidly in the dim light filtering down from the skylight. James found a section of records that made him pause. "Emily, according to this, the dog, Gabriel, isn't just a random spirit. He's a guardian specifically tied to children's healing. But his presence also attracts opposition, forces that don't want this kind of divine intervention in the world." The sound of more footsteps above spurred them to work faster. Emily quickly photographed Sister Margaret's most recent entries, which spoke of a ritual that could strengthen the connection between Gabriel and the hospital, protecting both the guardian and the children under his care. As they prepared to leave, Emily noticed something gleaming behind the pedestal. It was a small alcove, containing what appeared to be pieces of the original stained glass windows from the convent chapel, each depicting different scenes of the golden dog with children. Among the fragments was another medallion, identical to the first but broken in half. They barely made it back up the stairs and out of the maintenance room before the team the man had called for arrived. Hidden behind some storage containers, they watched as men in dark suits began cataloging and removing books from the chamber below. Later, in the safety of Emily's office, they reviewed their findings. The photographs revealed a complex history of spiritual guardianship, with Gabriel appearing throughout centuries of medical crises involving children. The broken medallion, which Emily had managed to grab before they fled, seemed to be part of a pair meant to be united during some kind of protective ritual. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," James said, his scientific skepticism now tempered by what they'd discovered. "These men, whoever they are, they knew about this place. They've probably been watching the hospital since Gabriel reappeared." Emily was about to respond when her pager went off. It was the pediatric ward. Noah Bennett was asking for her, and not just through normal baby sounds. According to the nurse's message, he had spoken his first word, Gabriel. As they rushed to the elevator, neither noticed the golden feather that had somehow made its way into Emily's bag, nor the way it seemed to shine brighter as storm clouds gathered over Boston. In the pediatric ward, monitors began recording unusual patterns again, and children throughout the hospital reported dreams of gardens filled with healing light. The mystery of St. Raphael's was deepening, and Emily and James now found themselves caught between forces they were only beginning to understand. Forces that had been waiting centuries for this moment to arrive. The pediatric ward buzzed with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the walls of St. Raphael's. News of Noah Bennett's first word had spread quickly among the staff, creating a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. Emily and James found Jessica Bennett cradling her son, tears of joy streaming down her face as Noah babbled happily, occasionally repeating Gabriel with remarkable clarity. "He's never said anything before," Jessica explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "The doctors told us the accident might have affected his speech development, but now..." She looked at James hopefully. "What does this mean?" James conducted a quick examination of Noah, his practiced movements betraying none of the turmoil of questions spinning in his mind. The baby's neural readings continued to show unprecedented patterns of activity, and there was something else, a subtle golden glow beneath his skin, visible only when the light hit him at certain angles. "Mrs. Bennett," James began carefully, "Noah's recovery is progressing remarkably well. However, I'd like to run a few more tests to better understand these developments." He caught Emily's eye, silently communicating the need to investigate further. As they stepped out of Noah's room, Emily noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Every child in the pediatric ward who had shown improvement was drawing or playing with toys featuring golden dogs. Even the teenagers were sketching similar images in their notebooks. each picture capturing Gabriel's otherworldly essence with surprising accuracy. "We need to talk," Emily whispered to James, leading him to a quiet consultation room. She pulled out the photographs they'd taken in the underground chamber, spreading them across the table. "Look at this, it's not just about healing. According to these records, Gabriel's presence affects children's perception of reality. They can see things adults can't." James picked up one of the photos showing an ancient text. "It says here that children naturally exist in a state between worlds, making them more receptive to spiritual guardians. But it also mentions something about a gathering of shadows that appears whenever Gabriel's influence grows stronger." As if on cue, the lights in the consultation room flickered. Through the window, they could see storm clouds gathering over Boston. Unusually dark for early afternoon, the broken medallion in Emily's pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, responding to something in the atmosphere. A knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah Martinez, the day shift nurse, entered with a concerned expression. "Dr. Reed, Emily, you need to see this. It's happening all over the ward." They followed her to the children's playroom, where an extraordinary scene awaited them. The young patients had arranged their beds and chairs in a perfect circle, mirroring the layout of the underground chamber. In the center, they'd created a makeshift altar using books and toys, topped with drawings of Gabriel. "They say they're preparing for something," Sarah explained, her voice hushed. "They've been like this all morning, working together as if they're following some kind of plan." Emily approached one of the older children, a 12-year-old girl named Lucy, who had been admitted for chronic respiratory issues. "Lucy, what are you preparing for?" Lucy looked up from her drawing, her eyes seeming to shine with an inner light. "The garden party," she said simply. "Gabriel showed us in our dreams. We need to be ready when the shadows come." Before Emily could ask more questions, a commotion erupted in the hallway. The man in the dark suit they'd seen in the basement was at the nurse's station, flashing some kind of badge. Two more men in similar attire flanked him, their presence creating an invisible pressure in the air. "I need to speak with Dr. James Reed and Nurse Emily Carter," the man announced, his voice carrying an authority that made the staff step back. "It's regarding some unauthorized access to restricted areas of the hospital." Emily felt the broken medallion grow hot against her skin. She glanced at James, who had already positioned himself between the men and the children's playroom. The storm outside intensified, rain beginning to lash against the windows with unusual force. Suddenly, all the children in the playroom began humming the same melody, a haunting tune that seemed to resonate with the storm itself. The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, Emily caught a glimpse of something extraordinary. A garden of light seemed to overlay the hospital walls, visible for just a fraction of a second, filled with blooming flowers that glowed like starlight. The men in suits approached, but before they could reach Emily and James, an orderly rushed up to them. "Sir, there's a situation in the basement. The chamber, it's filling with light." The lead man hesitated, torn between confronting Emily and James and investigating the new development. "Watch them," he ordered his colleagues before hurrying toward the elevator. Emily seized the moment of confusion to pull James aside. The ritual in Sister Margaret's journal. It mentioned a convergence of light and shadow during a storm. What if this is what the children are preparing for? James glanced at the growing darkness outside, then at the children who continued their mysterious preparations. "Emily, if we're going to protect Gabriel's secret, we need to understand what we're dealing with. These men, whoever they are, they want to control something that was meant to be free." Lucy approached them, holding out a drawing she'd just completed. It showed the broken medallion made whole again, surrounded by circles of children and light. "So you need to finish what Sister Margaret started," she said with a wisdom beyond her years, "before they find the way to send Gabriel away forever." The storm gathered strength, thunder rolling across the Boston skyline like drums in an ancient ceremony. In Noah's room, the baby laughed as he reached toward something invisible to adult eyes, his skin glowing more noticeably now. The men in suits consulted urgently on their phones, their confident demeanor showing cracks as events spiraled beyond their control. Emily clutched the broken medallion, feeling its power surge in response to the building energy in the hospital. Something was coming, a convergence of forces that had been set in motion decades ago. As she watched the children continue their preparations, she realized they weren't just getting ready for a metaphorical garden party. They were preparing for a battle between light and shadow. And somehow she and James had become its unlikely guardians. If you love animals and want to watch more amazing stories, don't forget to subscribe to help the author, leave a like, and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The storm that had gathered over St. Raphael's seemed to exist in its own reality, a swirling vortex of clouds centered perfectly above the hospital. Inside, Emily and James worked quickly to understand the ritual described in Sister Margaret's journal, while keeping an eye on the men in suits who continued to patrol the corridors with growing agitation. "Look at this entry," Emily said, pointing to a page they hadn't noticed before. The journal had begun revealing new text, as if responding to the growing energy in the building. Sister Margaret wrote about a night like this, when the barriers between worlds grew thin during a storm. She said the children could see gardens of light overlaying our world. James peered at the ancient text, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile what he was reading with what he was witnessing. Through the windows of the pediatric ward, the storm cast strange shadows that seemed to move with purpose, while bursts of lightning illuminated patches of impossible flowers blooming in midair. Lucy, the 12-year-old patient, had become their unexpected guide. "The gardens are getting closer," she announced, her voice carrying an otherworldly certainty. "Gabriel says we need to complete the circle before the shadows find their way in." The other children in the ward continued their preparations, arranging their beds and chairs with precise coordination. Their drawings of Gabriel had begun to glow faintly, each sketch seeming to capture a different aspect of the spiritual guardian's presence. Noah Bennett, still in his crib, had become the center of their formation. His improved condition had sparked something in the other children, as if his connection to Gabriel was strengthening their own. The golden glow beneath his skin had become more pronounced, visible now even under the harsh hospital lights. "Dr. Reed," Sarah called from the nurse's station. "You need to see these readings." The monitors tracking the children's vital signs were showing synchronized patterns, their neural activity aligning in ways that defied medical explanation. As they studied the readings, Emily felt the broken medallion grow warmer. She pulled it out, gasping as she saw golden light streaming from the fracture. The children immediately turned toward it, their eyes reflecting the same ethereal glow. "Now it's calling to its other half," Lucy explained, approaching Emily. "Like Gabriel is calling to us. We need to make the garden real here, just for a little while, so he can stay." A commotion from the basement drew their attention. The men in suits were rushing toward the elevators, speaking urgently into their phones. Through the open stairwell door, Emily and James caught glimpses of golden light pulsing from below. The underground chamber was awakening. "We need to move now," James said. His usual skepticism transformed into determined focus. "Whatever these men are planning, they're running out of patience, and I have a feeling we're running out of time." Emily consulted Sister Margaret's journal again, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The ritual requires both medallions and the presence of the children. Sister Margaret tried to complete it years ago, but something went wrong. "The forces opposing Gabriel. They found a way to break the medallions apart and scatter them." Thunder shook the building as Lucy tugged at Emily's sleeve. "We know where the other piece is," she said. "We've all seen it in our dreams. Gabriel showed us." The children began to sing, the same melodic humming from before, but now with words in a language that seemed to dance between ancient and new. As their voices filled the ward, the storm outside intensified, and the air itself began to shimmer with possibilities. James checked his tablet, his eyes widening at the data streaming in. The children's brain activity, it's creating some kind of coherent field. "Emily, whatever's happening here, it's changing the physical properties of the hospital itself." Through the windows, they could see the hospital grounds transforming. Gardens of light were beginning to materialize, ghostly flowers pushing through the veil between worlds. The shadows cast by the storm grew deeper, more purposeful, gathering at the edges of the light like waves preparing to crash. "The chapel," Lucy announced suddenly, her voice carrying above the storm. "The other half is in the chapel, behind the old altar. That's where they hid it when they tried to send Gabriel away, but they couldn't stop him from coming back when the children needed him." Emily shared a look with James. They both knew the men in suits would be guarding the chapel, but they also knew they had no choice. The broken medallion was pulling stronger now, like a compass pointing toward its missing half. "I'll go," Emily said, clutching the medallion. "You stay with the children. Whatever's coming, they'll need a doctor they trust. No, James replied, surprising her with the firmness in his voice. Sister Margaret's journal says the ritual needs both science and faith. That's why it failed before. They tried to separate what should work together. He took her hand, the gesture speaking volumes about how far the rational doctor had come. We do this together. The children's song grew stronger, and Noah's laughter joined it like bells in a celestial choir. Outside, the storm and shadows continued their dance, while gardens of light bloomed and faded in endless cycles. St. Raphael's stood at the center of it all, a nexus point between worlds where ancient powers were awakening. Emily and James made their way toward the chapel, the broken medallion lighting their path. Behind them, the children's voices rose in harmony with the storm, their song a bridge between worlds. And somewhere in the hospital, moving between light and shadow, a golden dog watched and waited, knowing that the moment of convergence was finally at hand. The journey to St. Raphael's chapel felt like walking through multiple realities at once. Emily and James moved carefully through corridors, where shadows danced against bursts of golden light, while the children's song echoed throughout the building like a protective spell. The broken medallion in Emily's hand pulsed stronger with each step, its warmth spreading up her arm and into her chest. "Wait," James whispered, pulling Emily into an alcove as two men in dark suits rushed past. Through the windows, they could see more figures moving across the hospital grounds, their movements precise and coordinated. The storm above had formed an eye directly over the building, creating an unsettling calm in the midst of chaos. "They're securing the perimeter," James observed, his years of military service before medical school showing in his tactical assessment. "Whatever they're protecting in the chapel, they're willing to go to extreme lengths to keep it hidden." Emily pulled out Sister Margaret's journal, its pages now seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. New text had appeared, as if written by an invisible hand. "The guardians of shadow fear what they cannot control. They believe faith must be regulated, measured, contained. But true healing comes from the heart's freedom to believe." A soft whine made them both turn. Gabriel sat at the end of the corridor, his golden fur rippling with internal light. The dog's presence seemed to push back the shadows, creating a path of clarity through the chaos. Without a sound, he turned and padded toward a service corridor, a route to the chapel they hadn't considered. "He's showing us the way," Emily whispered, the medallion growing warmer as they followed. The service corridor was narrow and rarely used, filled with old equipment and forgotten supplies. As they moved deeper into the hospital's older sections, the walls began to show traces of its history as a convent, worn stone beneath modern drywall, ancient symbols peeking through peeling paint. They emerged into a small courtyard, now enclosed by hospital additions but once part of the convent's gardens. Here, the storm's eye created a perfect circle of calm above them. In the center of the courtyard stood a statue of Saint Raphael, its weathered features softened by age and the strange light. "Emily, look!" James pointed to the statue's base. Carved into the stone were the same symbols from the medallion, arranged in a pattern that matched the children's circular formation in the pediatric ward. "They're connected." The children knew instinctively what to do, because this pattern is part of something bigger. A crash from the chapel made them duck behind the statue. Through the chapel's stained glass windows, they could see figures moving urgently, searching for something. The broken medallion suddenly felt like a living thing in Emily's hand, pulling her toward its other half. Gabriel appeared again, this time leading them to a maintenance door that connected the courtyard to the chapel's vestry. As they slipped inside, Emily noticed something remarkable. Wherever the dog walked, tiny flowers seemed to bloom in his footsteps, only to fade away moments later. The vestry was dark and cluttered, filled with old religious artifacts and forgotten ceremonial items. But among the shadows, something caught Emily's eye, a wooden box identical to the one they'd found in the underground chamber, hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. "It's been here all along," she breathed, carefully opening the box. Inside lay the other half of the medallion, its broken edge a perfect match for the piece she carried. As she brought the two pieces closer, they began to glow more intensely. James kept watch at the vestry door, monitoring the men searching the chapel. "Emily, whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. They're getting closer." The storm above the hospital intensified, its eye beginning to spin like a massive vortex. In the pediatric ward, The children's song reached a crescendo, their circle of beds and chairs now glowing with the same light that emanated from the medallion pieces. Emily's hands trembled as she held the two halves of the medallion close to each other. Sister Margaret's journal had mentioned this moment, the convergence of worlds, when the veil between realities grew thin enough for true healing to flow freely. Remember, she read from the journal's newest revelation, the medallion is not the source of power, but a key to unlock what already exists in the heart. The children know this. Gabriel knows this. Only adults forget that healing comes from belief in something greater than ourselves. As she prepared to join the pieces, a voice rang out from the chapel. "Stop, you don't understand what you're dealing with." The lead man in the dark suit stood in the doorway, his face stern, but his eyes betraying a hint of fear. That power was contained for a reason. Some forces aren't meant to be unleashed. "You're wrong." James stepped forward, positioning himself between Emily and the man. "I've seen what Gabriel can do. True healing isn't about control, it's about trust and faith." The man reached into his jacket, but before he could act, Gabriel materialized between them. The dog's presence filled the vestry with golden light, and for a moment, reality seemed to shift. Through the windows, they could see the hospital grounds transformed into gardens of light, while shadows gathered at the edges like waves held back by an invisible shore. Emily felt a surge of understanding. The medallion, the ritual, the children's circle, they weren't about controlling power, but about creating a space where healing could flow freely between worlds. With trembling hands, she brought the two halves of the medallion together. The moment they touched, a wave of golden light exploded outward, and the barriers between worlds began to blur. The children's song merged with the storm's voice, creating a harmony that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of St. Raphael's. And in that moment of convergence, Emily and James witnessed something extraordinary. A glimpse of the world as Gabriel saw it, where light and shadow danced in eternal balance and healing flowed like rivers between realms of possibility. The wave of golden light that erupted from the united medallion transformed St. Raphael's into something beyond ordinary reality. The walls of the old chapel seemed to breathe with ancient power, while the stained glass windows came alive with moving images, scenes from the hospital's long history of healing and hope. Emily stood transfixed, the complete medallion humming with energy in her hands. Through the golden haze, she could see the man in the dark suit backing away, his face a mixture of awe and resignation. Gabriel stood between them, his form now seeming to shift between that of a dog and something more, a being of pure light with golden wings barely visible in the glowing air. "My God," James whispered, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. It's like the hospital exists in multiple dimensions at once. The walls had become translucent, revealing layers of reality that had always existed but remained hidden from human eyes. They could see the children in the pediatric ward above, their circle now floating in a garden of light that stretched between worlds. Noah Bennett sat at the center, laughing as golden butterflies danced around his crib. "You've done it," Lucy's voice echoed through the transformed space, though she remained physically in the ward above. "You've opened the way. Now Gabriel can stay, and the garden can grow again." The man in the suit found his voice at last. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We've spent decades containing this power, keeping it controlled. The world isn't ready for this kind of miracle." "No," Emily replied, understanding flowing through her from the medallion. "You spent decades trying to control something that was meant to be free. Real healing doesn't come from control. It comes from trust and love." As if in response to her words, the golden light began to take shape, forming rivers of healing energy that flowed through the hospital's corridors. In the pediatric ward, monitors recorded impossible improvements in every child's condition. The golden glow beneath their skin matched the light that now filled the building, as if they were part of the same miraculous circuit. James watched in amazement as years of medical training were transformed by what he witnessed. The rivers of light didn't defy science, they expanded it, showing him a deeper layer of reality where faith and medicine could work together. He could see how Gabriel's presence catalyzed natural healing processes, accelerating them in ways that seemed magical but followed their own perfect logic. The storm above the hospital had become a spiral of golden clouds, its eye now a portal through which more healing light poured into the building. The shadows that had gathered at the edges began to retreat not defeated but restored to their natural balance in the world's great dance. Through the transformed walls, Emily and James could see the other men in suits leaving the hospital grounds, their purpose now meaningless in the face of something so much greater than control. The lead man remained, his stern facade crumbling as he watched decades of containment protocols dissolve. "I was here, you know," he said quietly, his voice heavy with memory. 30 years ago, when Sister Margaret first tried to complete the ritual, we thought we were protecting the world from chaos, but we were really just afraid of letting go, afraid of letting people believe in miracles." Gabriel padded over to the man, touching his hand gently with his nose. In that moment of contact, the man's expression changed, softened by understanding. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving his years of shadow guarding behind. The United Medallion had begun to change, its ancient symbols rearranging themselves into new patterns. Sister Margaret's journal, still in Emily's bag, was filling with new pages, recording this moment of transformation for future generations. Throughout the hospital, patients and staff alike found themselves experiencing the world in new ways. The barriers between science and faith, between the logical and the miraculous, had not broken, but rather become more permeable. Healing flowed more freely, guided by both medical knowledge and the gentle presence of their guardian spirit. Noah Bennett's parents watched in joyful tears as their son sat up in his crib, fully awake and aware, reaching out to pat Gabriel's golden fur. The dog's presence was more solid now, no longer needing to hide between worlds. He had found his place as a bridge between realities, a guardian whose existence proved that the most powerful healing came from the heart's ability to believe. In the chapel, Emily and James stood in the center of their transformed world, watching as the rivers of light established new patterns throughout the hospital. The medallion's glow had settled into a steady pulse, matching the rhythm of the children's song that still echoed through the corridors. "What happens now?" James asked, his voice full of wonder at the new world of possibilities before them. Emily smiled, understanding flowing through her from the medallion. "Now we learn to work with both worlds. Gabriel shows us that healing isn't just about medicine or miracles, it's about bringing them together, about letting hope and science dance as partners." Above them, the storm was dissolving into gentle golden rain that seemed to carry healing in every drop. The hospital gardens had burst into impossible bloom, flowers opening their petals to catch the miraculous precipitation, and everywhere, the boundaries between what was possible and impossible had become softer, more permeable, allowing wonder to flow as freely as faith. The days following the convergence brought changes to St. Raphael's that no one could have predicted. The golden light had settled into the very foundations of the hospital, no longer visible to ordinary eyes, but present in countless subtle ways. The gardens that had bloomed during the storm remained, flourishing impossibly in Boston's winter, their flowers carrying faint echoes of otherworldly light. Emily's morning rounds had taken on a new dimension. While she still checked vital signs and administered medications, she now worked in harmony with the gentle currents of healing energy that flowed through the hospital's corridors. Gabriel was a constant presence, moving freely between patients, his golden fur carrying the same subtle glow that now seemed to infuse everything in St. Raphael's. "It's remarkable," James said one morning, reviewing patient charts with Emily in his office. The walls still held traces of transparency in certain lights, offering glimpses of the multiple layers of reality they now knew existed. Every child who was present during the convergence has maintained their connection to what they call the garden. They're healing at rates that defy every medical textbook I've ever read. Emily touched the United Medallion, which she now wore on a chain around her neck. It had become a bridge of sorts, allowing her to sense the flows of healing energy and guide them where they were needed most. "It's not just the children," she replied. "The entire hospital has changed. Even the staff members who don't consciously remember the convergence can feel it. Have you noticed how many of them have started bringing flowers to work?" Indeed, St. Raphael's had become something of a phenomenon in the medical community. While the dramatic events of the convergence had been visible only to those directly involved, its effects were undeniable. Recovery rates had soared, particularly in the pediatric ward, and the hospital's atmosphere had taken on a quality that visitors often struggled to describe, a sense of peace and possibility that seemed to embrace everyone who entered. Lucy, now fully recovered from her respiratory issues, had become an unofficial ambassador between the children and the hospital staff. She could still see the rivers of light clearly, and had a particular talent for knowing when and where Gabriel's presence was most needed. "It's like learning a new language," she explained to Emily one afternoon, sitting in the hospital's transformed garden. Winter flowers bloomed around them, their petals catching impossible glimmers of gold in the pale sunlight. "The garden shows us where healing wants to flow, and we just have to help it along." The other children who had been part of the convergence shared similar abilities, each in their own way. Some could see the patterns of light that indicated approaching illness, while others had developed an intuitive understanding of what different patients needed, whether it was medical intervention or simply the comfort of Gabriel's presence. Noah Bennett had become something of a miracle in medical circles, though his parents chose to keep the full story private. At 18 months old, he was now hitting all his developmental milestones, his previously damaged neural pathways having been restored during the convergence. The golden glow beneath his skin had faded to a subtle luminescence that only appeared when he laughed, which was often, especially when Gabriel was near. James had undergone perhaps the most profound professional transformation. The doctor, who had once relied solely on empirical evidence, now worked to bridge the gap between traditional medicine and the hospital's newfound healing energy. He'd begun documenting the ways in which Gabriel's presence affected various medical treatments, creating a new framework for understanding how faith and science could work together. "I'm not saying we should abandon traditional medicine," he explained to a gathering of curious colleagues from other hospitals. "I'm saying we need to expand our definition of what healing can be. The convergence showed us that there are more layers to reality than we imagined, and true healing happens when we learn to work with all of them." The United Medallion had become both a symbol and a tool, its ancient symbols still shifting and changing to reflect the hospital's needs. Emily had learned to interpret these changes, understanding when they indicated the need for more traditional medical intervention and when they suggested letting Gabriel's gentle influence take the lead. Sister Margaret's journal, now filled with new insights about the convergence and its aftermath, had become a guide for this new way of healing. Emily and James spent their free moments studying its pages, learning how to maintain the delicate balance between worlds that the hospital now embodied. The man in the dark suit, whose name they learned was Daniel Richardson, had made peace with the transformation in his own way. Rather than trying to contain the hospital's power, he now served as a discreet liaison between St. Raphael's and other institutions where similar energies had been detected. His organization, once dedicated to containment, was slowly learning to protect these sacred spaces in a different way, by letting them flourish naturally. One evening, as the sun set over Boston, Emily found herself in the chapel where it had all began. The stained glass windows still came alive at certain moments, showing scenes from the hospital's continuing story of healing and hope. Gabriel lay at her feet, his presence as solid as ever, but somehow also transcendent, bridging the visible and invisible worlds that now coexisted so naturally at St. Raphael's. "We've created something beautiful here," James said. Joining her in the chapel, he carried a thick folder of patient records, documented miracles that would never be published but would be preserved in the hospital's archives alongside Sister Margaret's journal. Emily smiled, watching the last rays of sunlight transform the chapel into a symphony of color and shadow. The United Medallion hummed softly against her skin, responding to the evening's transition between worlds. "We didn't create it," she replied, "but we just learned to see what was always here. The endless dance between science and faith, between the visible and invisible, between what we know and what we believe." Outside, the hospital gardens bloomed in the gathering dusk, their flowers catching the last light like countless tiny stars. The boundaries between worlds remained permeable, allowing healing to flow freely wherever it was needed. And through it all, Gabriel continued his rounds, a guardian spirit in physical form, teaching everyone at St. Raphael's that the greatest miracles often come from simply believing in the possibility of more. 1 year after the convergence, St. Raphael's Children's Hospital had become a place where miracles didn't just happen. They were understood, welcomed, and integrated into the very fabric of healing. The garden that had bloomed during that transformative storm had become a permanent feature of the hospital grounds, its otherworldly flowers thriving in every season, offering hope and comfort to all who visited. Emily stood by the window of her office, now located in what they called the Bridge Wing, a new addition to the hospital specifically designed to facilitate the blend of traditional medicine and spiritual healing. The united medallion around her neck caught the morning light, sending tiny reflections dancing across her walls like remembered fragments of that miraculous night. "The latest results are in," James announced, entering her office with a tablet in hand. His white coat now bore a subtle embroidered symbol, the same one from the medallion, marking him as one of the physicians trained in what they had come to call convergence care. "The integration program is showing unprecedented success rates. 3 more hospitals have requested our guidance in establishing their own bridge units." Emily smiled, watching a group of children in the garden below. Lucy, now a regular volunteer despite her young age, was leading them in what looked like ordinary play, but was actually a subtle form of energy work, helping new patients attune to the hospital's unique healing atmosphere. Gabriel moved among them, his golden presence as strong as ever, though now he was officially registered as a therapy dog, perhaps the most unusual one in medical history. "Sister Margaret would be proud," Emily said, touching the journal that always remained on her desk. Its pages had continued to fill with wisdom and guidance, recording not just history, but the ongoing evolution of their understanding. "We finally achieved what she envisioned, a place where faith and science work together without boundaries." The transformation of St. Raphael's had rippled out into the medical community in unexpected ways. While the full story of the convergence remained known only to those who had experienced it directly, its principles had begun to influence healthcare approaches around the world. The integration of spiritual wellness with medical treatment was no longer seen as alternative. It was becoming essential. Noah Bennett, now a thriving toddler, had become their brightest example of this integrated approach. His recovery had been documented in numerous medical journals, though the full extent of Gabriel's involvement remained their gentle secret. The golden glow that occasionally shimmered beneath his skin had faded to a subtle luminescence that appeared only in moments of pure joy, moments that seemed to occur whenever Gabriel was near. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" James asked, joining Emily at the window. "About guardian angels watching over your patients. I used to think it was just a nice sentiment, but now." He gestured to the garden below, where Gabriel had paused to let a young patient lean against his sturdy frame, golden light briefly visible where they touched. The hospital itself had evolved to support their new understanding of healing. The walls remained subtly permeable to those who knew how to look, allowing glimpses of the light rivers that flowed through the corridors. Each room now included space for both medical equipment and quiet contemplation, recognizing that healing happened on multiple levels simultaneously. Daniel Richardson, the former containment agent, had become one of their strongest allies. His organization had transformed from a force of suppression to one of protection and guidance, helping other institutions recognize and nurture their own sacred spaces. He often visited St. Raphael's, sitting quietly in the garden, finding his own healing in the presence of what he had once feared. The children who had been part of the convergence held a special place in the hospital's community. Though many had fully recovered and returned to their normal lives, they maintained a connection to St. Raphael's that transcended ordinary patient care. They understood the garden's language, could see the flows of healing energy, and helped new patients bridge the gap between the visible and invisible aspects of their recovery. Lucy, in particular, had discovered her calling. Despite her youth, she showed remarkable insight into the hospital's deeper workings. "The garden isn't just here," she often explained to new patients. "It's everywhere healing is needed. We just had to learn how to let it grow." As the morning light strengthened, Emily and James headed to the pediatric ward for their rounds. The hospital corridors hummed with a subtle energy that had become familiar, the convergence of medical expertise and spiritual grace that made St. Raphael's unique. Monitors and machines worked alongside gentle currents of healing light, each playing their part in the dance of recovery. Gabriel met them at the ward entrance, his presence announcing their arrival to the children who still saw him most clearly. The dog's role had evolved too, becoming a bridge not just between worlds but between different approaches to healing. His golden fur still shimmered with otherworldly light, but now it seemed more natural, as if the boundary between miracle and reality had softened permanently. "It's amazing," Emily said, watching a young patient's face light up at Gabriel's approach, "how something so extraordinary can become so beautifully normal." James nodded, understanding flowing between them like the rivers of light they had learned to see. That's the real miracle, isn't it? Not the dramatic moments of convergence, but the quiet integration of wonder into everyday life. As they began their rounds, the united medallion pulsed gently against Emily's skin, reminding her of the constant flow of healing that now moved through St. Raphael's. The hospital had become more than a place of medical care. It was a sanctuary where science and faith danced together, where the boundaries between visible and invisible remained permeable, and where every day brought new opportunities for healing in all its forms. The garden continued to bloom outside, its flowers catching the morning light like countless tiny stars, and through the corridors, Gabriel made his rounds, a guardian spirit in earthly form, reminding everyone at St. Raphael's that true healing comes from believing in the endless possibilities that exist between heaven and earth, between science and faith, between the world as we know it and the world as it could be. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Emily, James, Ed, and Gabriel has touched your hearts and reminded you of the magic that exists in our everyday world. The healing power of love, faith, and compassion knows no boundaries, just like Gabriel's unwavering dedication to the children of St. Raphael's. If this story has moved you, please remember to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that miracles still happen, and that sometimes they come in the form of a golden dog with knowing eyes and a heart full of light. Don't forget to let us know in the comments what this story meant to you. And stay tuned for more tales that explore the extraordinary moments that make life truly magical.